Hello everyone and welcome to my next video. Thank you for joining me today. Today we're going to be modifying this miniature for use in skirmish games. The primary goal was to enter this into the Yellow Cube contest currently going on social media, put forward by Apocrypha Now, a very talented creator, someone who I highly recommend you follow. So right away we're going to go ahead and start texturing this miniature. This here is Agrellan Earth. And if you're familiar with Agrellan Earth, you'll know that when it dries, it creates a cracked pattern, like a cracked earth or a dried riverbed. And I was hoping it would create that effect for texture. So this is one option that I used for creating texture on the model, specifically on the elbows, because I wanted it to be a transition from one color to another. And if you've seen this model before, you'll know that it has, first off, a head, which I cut off, and also fire running along its back and down the back of its legs down to about the heels. I didn't want to use any of that. I didn't want to bother texturing over it, so I cut it off with some sprue cutters, but man, it was a lot of work and it wasn't worth recording. This is some basing paste that I have on hand that I use for pretty much everything lately. But as far as I can tell, it's essentially grit suspended in paint. At least that's kind of what it seems like to me. So if I lay it on wherever the color is, you're not going to be able to see that once you prime the model. You won't be able to tell the difference between the plastic of the model and the medium that this grit is suspended in. I don't really have any kind of rhyme or reason for where I textured this. I mostly did it on the legs, but I could have done it all over the place. For the idea that I had in mind, I didn't want to do the hands. I cut off the head using a small wood saw. Try to cut as cleanly as I could through it. This is essentially repackaged Woodland Scenics product. It's just lichen. They do make for easy bushes, but you might find it under a different brand as lichen. And I took some PVA. You can use PVA or Mod Podge Matte. I use Mod Podge Matte for this. Put in just a little bit of water to make it slightly thinner, but I still wanted it to have a lot of body, so I ended up adding even more PVA to the mix. And then I just soaked the lichen, which I had broken apart to try to get it to not be as bulky as it was before. And there's really no magic to this. I'm just kind of piling it on where I wanted it to go. In this case, I wanted it on the shoulders. Now that I know that this works well, I could have gone even further along the body, maybe down the legs, down the front. And of course, having PVA all over my hands means that I gotta be careful how I maneuver this miniature. But the PVA gives a good coating to the lichen, and it bonds really well to the plastic. I was beating on this with a brush, and I didn't really find that it came off easily. In fact, it didn't come off at all. PVA, pulls through and holds everything in place. So it looks like a mess. Man, does it look like a mess. But once it's primed, it'll make a lot more sense. You won't really see where one texture ends, one texture begins. It'll all blend nicely. So excuse the color temperature change. I can't seem to quite get that right. So now it's time to texture the back, and it's going to go from the base of the neck all the way down to the ankles. And this is really simple. It's basically just using all sorts of tufts that I have left over. Some of these are Vallejo, some of these are Citadel, but they're tufts that I just kind of had lying around that I didn't really have plans for. And I felt like they'd be a good service for this weird furry texture on the back. And again, there's really no science to this. The only thing I would say is that if you want this to look like a mane on a wild animal, your longer tufts should probably be along the back. Your shorter tufts are the ones that are going to go down the legs, or at least anywhere that's not the back. So if you wanted to work it down the shoulders, down the arms some, I would use shorter tufts for that. Some of these tufts aren't wide enough to actually go around the clear plastic that I cut off, so after gluing them in place, I made sure that it wrapped properly. And although I add a lot of super glue, it keeps things wet so I can move and readjust as needed. This is all going to be covered up, so it's okay if glue dries where it shouldn't. And if you happen to have tufts that are a different shape, or if they're using different flock for them, those would make for really interesting textures too. For instance, there are some tufts where they don't just use a straight static grass texture. They use something with interspersed leaves or some kind of spiky static grass. And those would be really good options for this. Now, just to be thorough, these dried for a very long time. I let this thing over for like a week, I think it was, before I got back to it. That's probably overkill, but it made sure that when I got to it, it was all thoroughly dried. So now that everything's primed, you can see how it unifies all the textures. You can't really see any boundaries for where one texture starts and then the raw plastic begins. These miniatures come already primed, but I'm not really a fan of the primer that they use, so I threw on my own, and this one stuck, no problem. Now on the back with all the static grass, or fur if you want to call it that, I made sure to add extra care just to be sure that it would cover it properly. So I do a mix of sunset purple and deep red for my base coat. No particular reason, but because I was building red, I like my shades to have some interest in them besides just being a darker red, in this case building off of a purple. And while this purple looks absolutely insane right now, that's because it's fresh off the palette. Once it dries, the saturation will come down some. Now you'll see me use this mix all over. That's because it's my base coat. But subsequent layers, as I pick out the volumes, I'm not going to do as much coverage. Because this is my base coat and I don't want pure black showing, I make sure that I get 100% of the skin on this model, which means that I don't get the hooves. I don't get the forearms and hands because I want that to be black. But I do fill everything else in. I try to be careful while I paint next to the fur, but I can always go back and touch that up with some pure black. I'm using an oval brush. I think this is like a 1/2 inch brush, just because I want a lot of coverage quickly. It is a large model after all. So this is deep red, still a little bit of that purple in it. But now I want to build this up on the upper half of the body, and I'm still considering this my base coat. And in some ways, I'm not really brushing in some parts because there's so much texture and I want to make sure that I cover it properly. I'm pushing the brush in and moving it around just to get as good a coverage as I can. Now, I was pleasantly surprised that the PVA coated lichen dried so well. I mean, I know people use PVA soaked materials for all sorts of textures and things like trees or fabrics or tarps, but it worked really well here, which means I know I can use it in the future for things like roots, for instance. Or if I want more of this texture, or if I want bramble. So that's another bit of knowledge in my pocket. At this point, I still wasn't entirely sure what color I wanted that bramble-like texture to be, but I base coated it anyway just to be safe, and if I wanted it to be any other color, I could just as easily paint over it. You'll see there's a magnet on the neck where the cut is. Not entirely sure what size of magnet that is. It might be a 5mm diameter, but for sure it's 1mm thickness. I wanted the lowest profile magnet I could get, so anything that sits on top will be as flush as possible. Otherwise I'd have to cut into whatever that shape is to get it to look as smooth a transition as I can get. And when you buy these online, you get loads and loads and loads of them. It also means I can magnetize anything I can think of. Now this is blood red, so now we're getting into the truer, more vibrant reds. And my volumes are getting smaller. You see now that I've switched over to a smaller brush. That's because I want to be more selective about the volumes that I'm picking out. You'll get a pretty good view of the end result of my base coating, which is a purplish red lower body, probably a little more purple than purplish red, and a reddish, slightly purple upper body. And you know, with so much texture on this, if you wanted to take it to this point and then just dry brush the next color, that'd probably look great. After that, you could probably leave it alone or do a single color, very specific highlights. But I was building and building and building these reds, and I wanted to keep going so I can punch in more depth by working in the highlights. So focusing on one end of the spectrum helps out the other. So if you put more work in your shades, your highlights are going to pop more. And if you put more work in your highlights, your shades are going to pop more as well. So if you ever feel like your model is lacking something, focus on one of those areas and see what it does to your model. Now, one thing that some people might have picked up on is that I'm not using any washes. I didn't use it on my previous miniature. Not using any kind of acrylic wash, any kind of ink, or any kind of oil wash. There's a reason why I don't use oils, but I'll cover that in a later video when I do decide to use oils. But as I'm painting, I'm not trying to hit a checklist. In other words, I'm not trying to mark off a list of tasks and say, okay, I've got my base coat done, exactly 2 layers. I've got this many layers done to build up the highlights. I've done my edge highlighting, I've done my wash, and so on and so on and so on. I try to go based on what I think the model needs at the time. And people watching this might disagree and might think that this needs a wash, and that's perfectly fine. But to my eyes, I thought the wash wasn't really necessary. I felt that I'd built up enough depth without it, and I didn't want to shift the color either way with a wash. But just because I don't use it doesn't mean you shouldn't. If you've been enjoying using washes and you like the effect you get on your models, by all means continue on with it. It is your style after all, and these are your minis. And this is your personal development, more than anything. And part of the reason I show the swatches especially is because I know Scale 75 is not the most commonly used color, or brand I should say. So hopefully the swatches help you pick out something that's equivalent to the brand that you prefer. You have to forgive me for some of the issues with the focus. I'm not really good at setting up autofocus on my camera, but I definitely need to experiment a little more. And I say camera, but I'm just filming with my phone. So now I'm going to try to blend transition on the forearms. And just because I had it handy, I'm using my Scale Color Artist Art Black. You know, the one that comes in a tube. So I'm building up a bunch of paint on here and trying to move it around, and I'm kind of making mud here. It wasn't working for me too well. But I go back and forth, building up more paint, kind of trying to build a bank of color that I could then, after cleaning my brush off, move into the other color. In this case, I'm trying to deposit some red on the arm and then drag that into the black. So see, there's more fresh red paint that I'm going to try to drag into the black. Now I'm painting the hand with the same black I was using before, and it'll dry nice and flat, which will give me a slightly different color to the rest of the body. Now it's all flat, but it almost feels to me like the Scale Color Artist Black has a even flatter finish. I don't know if that's possible, or maybe my eyes are playing tricks on me. But I'm rebuilding some of the black that I lost to the blend, and with a clean brush I'm trying to feather it back up, and I'm trying to be as gentle as possible here because I don't want to drag a big old streak of black into the red. So I'm not adding any black, I'm just pulling up the black that's already there that hasn't dried yet. So now Antares red is a very, very, very bright red, and the next level up from this has some orange in it. So this is probably about as high as I want to go in terms of using pure reds. And as before, the volumes are just getting smaller and smaller. I'm no longer painting a full muscle group or any part of the skin that's stretched out. Picking out what I think will make it look more alive and more three-dimensional, which is interesting to say considering that this is a three-dimensional mini. Now, I don't normally paint miniatures this size, and it's not that I'm avoiding it or anything. It just, stuff that comes across my desk doesn't usually get this big. But doing this has been a way to challenge myself. And stepping out of my comfort zone and forcing myself to try something different is a way for me to grow personally as a painter. And that's different for everybody. For some people, you know, entering competitions, whether timed or not, is how they find they grow. I entered a competition a couple times recently where you have 8 hours to paint a mystery miniature, and that's definitely helped me paint faster. For some people, repetition is enough to grow as a painter. You know, people will tell you that you should practice with intent and with the goal of improving in that session. And it's something I try to keep in mind every time I paint, even if it's something really simple like an edge highlight or layering a color on top of another or dry brushing. If it's a project like this, I'll do it with the intent that I want to do it better and better and better compared to the last time I did. Now I'm adding in pure Mars Orange, and this is going to be even more selective than anything that's come before. The absolute finest points in very small quantities or very small lines. I'm trying to keep my brush as sharp as possible for this so I have the most control. And for a pretty terrible brush, it's doing a pretty good job holding that point. I don't note that there's much use in going any higher than this. You certainly could. You could add like a light flesh tone to the Mars Orange to make it even lighter. But then you're just going back to the orange volumes that you painted and dotting them with the tiniest touch of color. And for me, this is about as far as I need to go. Now, I had some serious thoughts about what color I wanted to make this model, and I think the color that would have worked fine with any style of head that I go with would have been like an off-white. And an off-white would have been fun to paint because it's a little easier to add your blues, greens, yellows, and purples as a wash in certain spots to indicate bruising or, you know, capillaries filled with blood close to the surface of the skin. Like if you were to look at your knuckles or your elbows or your knees, you'll see that they're slightly different color than the rest of your skin. And starting from a pale canvas, it'd be much easier to show that. But I was hit at the last second with the idea to paint this guy red, and I like painting red, so that idea won out. But this is such a cool mini, and with such a great pose, I may just grab another one to do this again somewhere down the line. Now onto the fur, and the first color we're going to use is Mediterranean blue. I do load my brush, but I'm not trying to work this in all the way down into the fur. I'm trying to catch the upper half of the static grass I'll try to get as close to the skin as possible without depositing any blue on it. And I realized that having blue fur against the red body kind of makes this model look like a Muppet, but I think that's kind of the charm with it too. A very sinister, scary looking Muppet, or a scarier Muppet if you've always been afraid of Muppets. Now to highlight this, I'm going to use Adriatic Blue. And this is where I think you can get really creative. You can do it down the middle like this, or you can kind of do like a stripe pattern. I think that'd be really fun to see on this much fur. And I'd like to hear y'all's thoughts about what colors you might use for this. Do you think that maybe red fur with a blue body would look cooler? Would you have gone with the pale-skinned monster demon thing? Would you have done warmer colors? Would you have left their hair black? I thought it looked pretty cool that way. It would certainly work really well with the hands. But give me your thoughts, share them, and if you ever get around to painting something like this, tag me and let me know. I'd love to see it. I'm going to block in the hooves here with black. And now I'm using birch, little by little adding it to the black and painting striations on the hooves. Hooves are essentially one giant fingernail. At least that's how they are on horses. This is a cloven hoof? But regardless, I painted the striations with that mix with birch and black, progressively adding a little more birch. And because I want these lines to be pretty close together, I'll go back in and fill in those gaps as well. And something I didn't mention, which I hope you can kind of see, I went back with Mars Orange and very carefully dry brushed it, particularly on the thighs there, but also picked out some spots on the chest. And here we have the cube, one of the purposes of this project. And I thought it'd be fun to do multiple variations on that cube. These were cut on a hot wire cutter, so I measured out a 1-inch cube, cut 3 of them, and then cut these shapes out of them. For one, I cut out a bunch of plates. The other one, I cut them into smaller cubes, and I glued them all together using PVA. Then I base coated them using black paint. Now, I'm starting my yellow with Dubai Brown. And by and large, I find Dubai Brown a good start for my yellows. And there's a couple different ways to start, but this makes it a little less painful when you're starting from a black primer. Now this one's got a bunch of different faces. Definitely the harder one to paint, but I think the end result looks so cool that it was absolutely worth doing it. Again, using my oval brush just because it'll hold a lot more paint. Now the paint and the XPS foam that this is built on is making a really interesting texture. And this is just a Rocco over that previous layer, but back to what I was saying, it's making a really interesting texture. And I meant to add some of the basing paste to the faces of this so that I could have, even more texture built on it. But at the same time, the lighter texture that I get from the foam and the paint still makes for a pretty cool result. And I'd had ideas like engraving stuff in the faces here. If you consider this like a cube demon or a geometry demon, then how cool would it be to have math equations on some of these faces? Despite what my career is, math was not my strong suit in school. Except for geometry, I excelled at geometry. But I think a quadratic equation on one of these faces would have been awesome. I'm using Pro Acryl Golden Yellow because their golden yellow is a little more warm than the Scale 75 Soul Yellow. And there's certainly all sorts of different ways you can go with the yellow for a creature like this. In fact, now's probably a good chance to talk about the yellow cube fandom, situation, phenomena going on social media. Apocrypha now created a supplement for Morkborg. In that supplement, you encounter a yellow cube, and one of the unfortunate side effects of encountering that cube is that you might have your own head turned into cubes. And so this is based on what he posted on his story, but he converted some stuff to kind of get that across, and then people just started doing it on their own, and it became a whole thing. There's a contest currently going on, around when I post this video, and it's just spawned some of the coolest creations. And what's great about this is that it's basically miniatures agnostic. Ben Has Hobbies has a great video about creating a turnip army where everyone has a yellow cube head, and the result is so cool. I mean, the whole video is amazing, but the result of all those yellow cubes on the battlefield looks great. And someone on one of the Discord communities I'm on asked, what the hell is the deal with the yellow cube? And I gave kind of a dismissive answer where I told him that I gave him the old Morpheus quote from The Matrix, where, you can't really be told what the yellow cube is, you kind of have to see it for yourself, which I understand was pretty dismissive. I feel a little bad about it, but it's true. If you see this and, it might just click with you, and, it's endlessly amusing to me. Not only how far it's blown up, but also what people have created with it. I'm obviously creating a large monstrous creature here, but I created a character for Necropolis, I suppose. It's a skirmish size model, so I'll probably use it for any number of skirmish games. But I wasn't sure what I was going to do with that model, and so I thought, let me just put a yellow cube on it. And it ended up becoming one of my favorite characters. So watching this blow up the way it has been really cool. So what I did on some of these cubes was I based them with a mix of Soul Yellow and Mars Orange, because I was getting a little frustrated that I wasn't getting the brilliance that I really was after. Now my edge highlighting is going to be Tenera Yellow. Tenera Yellow is one of those really great utility paints, is what some might call them. They mix well with a lot of other colors to give you a lighter color without having to use white. Kind of shifts the color in a different way. Other brands might refer to it like as an ice yellow or a pale yellow, but I find myself using it for all sorts of things. Even if I'm not using yellow, if I'm painting something with like a brown and I want to get lighter and lighter, I'll mix in Tenera Yellow. Likewise, if I'm doing gold non-metallics, I'll probably use some Tenera Yellow in there somewhere. And all this edge highlighting is some of the easiest stuff to do in the world. Just use the side of your brush and rub it against that edge. And now for the test, let's see if we can find the proverbial golden angle. I think all three of these colors together look great. It's just a wild looking creature. I'm a big fan of this one. And I drew a lot of inspiration from these from Destiny, from Rulk, I believe it was. These weird geometric patterns just strike me in a certain way, and I wanted to jump on it for this miniature. Now here's a pyramid I cut out using a hot wire cutter as well. And you can see kind of how it has a really interesting texture because of all the gaps within the styrofoam. It might have been fun to pick those out as well to highlight them a little more. This is Mediterranean blue. I'm going to paint this all the way around. I'm going to base coat the whole thing. And these were actually primed with a special primer that doesn't have the same propellant that other primers do, so that way it won't eat away at the styrofoam. And that might be an effect you want, especially for terrain, but I wanted to keep these nice clean edges, so I had to use a primer that would not eat away at my model. So now two opposite faces will be painted with like a mix of Adriatic and Mediterranean blue to line it up, and then the final remaining face will be painted pure Adriatic blue. It doesn't show up too much, but the faces do have different tones. You have one primary face that catches more light and therefore is brighter, and that's the pure Adriatic blue, and the opposite face is pure Mediterranean blue. And the highlights are Adriatic blue with a little bit of birch just to brighten it up some. And this guy looks absurd. Looks like a fan favorite creature from Evangelion. And if I was really crazy, I would have done a full diamond, maybe someday, but for now I think just half is fine. So now here's another option. It's a sphere. I cut the bottom to flatten it, just so that it transitions a little better from the neck to the spherical head when I attach it to the body. I'm basing this in Mediterranean blue. Now this is kind of on a whim, but I wanted a head that matched the colors that I use on the body, so the top half in blue and the bottom half in red. And maybe I could have mixed these there along the border to make a purple. But these heads were so easy to make. I mean, I got a whole pack of these styrofoam balls for pretty cheap. And I have plenty of magnets, and I can always cut another one of these and prime it and make any number of heads for any number of games, really. Because of the magnets, I can make any kind of creature I want. And it got me to thinking, you know, obviously the pose is very scary, sinister, imposing. So it fit great in any number of skirmish games where you're fighting like kind of an alien. Majestic 13 is one that comes to mind. But also Verrotwood has stats for, you know, something in the woods, something that's unknown but just terrifying. And this might fit into something like that. Necropolis has rules for encounters with a single large enemy in the middle of the battlefield. This one could definitely stand in for that. Now, we're going to use this permanent marker and draw in some patterns. Anything to make this character look a little more otherworldly and incomprehensible. Something beyond our understanding. And just because it's beyond our understanding does not necessarily mean that it is hostile. We might have hostile intent, but this character might not. You know, there's some amazing non-combat tabletop games being created right now. Apple Picking 28, Herding 28, Fishing 28, which spawned a lot of cool spins on what fishing is. Tabletop Solo Pet Nursery, which is exactly what it sounds like. Why not make this creature one of those denizens of that petting zoo? Or why not have this creature be part of a mission where the objective is to protect them or observe them, as opposed to capturing or killing them or destroying them? You know, maybe you observe the creature for so long, and then if you're caught, then they escape, and you can no longer gather data. Maybe that's a good idea for a future game. Birdwatching 28, or Zoology 28, or Cryptozoologist 28. I could have done this with a brush, but I thought the marker would be easier, and it absolutely was. I didn't really have any plans for what I wanted to do with the pattern. Can you tell? One of the really fun things that came about with this whole yellow cube wave was that it was almost like a lore sort of developed between the people that participated in this. You know, there were a lot of people posting yellow cubes, but then there were others who posted even weirder things. I think one of my favorite ones was a pink circle or torus or donut. And then the wildest one I saw was a Mobius strip. This is going to be a weird one. I used Dubai Brown as a base, and then adding birch to it, I stipple on every layer that comes after. And this is me completely flying by the seat of my pants. I had no idea where this was going to go. I just knew that I wanted to build this texture up and then see where it leads me. So at this point I'm thinking, okay, it kind of looks like a stone. It maybe not the right color for it, but it kind of looks like a moon. You know, maybe we can do something with that. You know, tell a story as you're painting, and that might lead you in a certain direction that you didn't expect to go. And I certainly did not expect to go in this direction while I was working on this. And before we get to the next part, I'd just like to say that the response to the first video was so overwhelming. It's far and above what I expected. And thank you to everyone who watched and everyone who shared. And it was especially flattering that some of the people that I was thinking about in the video when I talked about the ones that inspire me and motivate me to paint were ones who shared it with the people that they know. And that was incredibly flattering. So thank you for watching, and thank you for coming back. I plan to do a lot more of these in the future. So digging back into another well of inspiration I had, this might be familiar to all of you out there who enjoy Evangelion, but I thought I'd put in these very, very weird eyes onto this model. I thought one looked pretty good on this moon head, but then I couldn't control myself and I added more. Now the danger with using the finer point of this permanent marker is that you can easily punch through the texture of the styrofoam. So just keep that in mind if you want to do something like this. I wasn't sure how many of these I wanted to do, but a number instantly popped into my head, and it's probably going to pop into your head too. How many of these did I want to do on this head? And I stopped at 7. You know, is this a weird moon presence or an angel? Something completely alien to us or far from what we imagined. It's got 7 eyes, 6 open, 1 closed. What does the 7 stand for? 7 sins, 7 virtues. Is 7 virtues a thing? I'm not sure. Anyway, when I it still makes me laugh. When I put this on the head, I got a pretty big laugh because it was crazier than I expected, and I fell in love with this thing. Just love how weird it looks. Very, very happy with this one, yeah. So now to my basing, and this is essentially what I did previously. I'm getting some wet blending practice in by slapping some colors onto the base and blending them by hand. And I don't clean the brush, so you can see what happens here because of that. Got a little bit of that brown still in the brush after I loaded it with the gray. And I don't mind that because that just means that I get some interesting results when I'm moving the brush around. And which is great because when I'm painting bases like this, I like having different colors to help make the texture pop even more. It could be any kind of dirt or loam, silt, or clay. It's just a fun way to paint bases like this. And I do put a couple of tufts of grass, and at the very beginning I had an idea of what I wanted to do with this mini. I thought that if I placed a couple tufts around the feet before priming and then primed it after, I could paint around those tufts that are now blackened by the primer and make it look like everywhere this creature steps, it corrodes the ground and kills any life in that soil. I didn't go for it this time, but maybe on a future creature. And of course, more of this weathering powder. And because the base is so big, I don't end up covering the entire base 100% like I'd done before. And the base probably could have used a fallen log or some stone or some kind of resin bits to bring more visual interest to it. I didn't have any particular game in mind when I created this creature, but that just means that I can use it in any game that I want. And therein lies the beauty of miniatures agnostic war games. All your creations will find more than one home. And if this creature is meant to be interdimensional or an interstellar traveler, then what better way to build a history and a journey than by visiting as many different games as it can. And there it is, my Yellow Cube entry for this contest put on by Apocrypha Now. I love how it came out, and although I really like the Yellow Cube heads, I think I love the weird angel moon head the most. And I had no plans for that, it kind of just happened as I worked on this. But thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you in the next one. Happy painting, y'all.